My name is Margaret Ellison. I am 72 years old, white, and I have lived most of my life in the quiet coastal town of Whitcomb, where the sea air smells of salt and worn wood. I was widowed when I was 40, left to raise my only son, Daniel, after my husband Peter died suddenly from a heart attack while fixing a loose tile on our roof. I can still see him that morning, his hair tousled from the wind, smiling at me through the kitchen window before stepping onto the ladder for the last time. His absence hollowed the house in a way that no furniture could fill, and it left me holding the weight of two lives, mine and Daniel's. I worked days at the post office, sorting envelopes with hands that ached by noon, and in the evenings I scrubbed the floors of the town's only hotel until my knees swelled. I learned to make a pound stretch like elastic, feeding Daniel on hearty stews and teaching him that books could take him anywhere even if we could not afford to travel. I kept the house spotless, not out of vanity, but out of a stubborn belief that order could keep grief at bay. I paid for his school uniforms with coins collected in an old biscuit tin, and when he turned 18, I emptied my savings so he could attend university without the burden of debt. I watched him walk across that graduation stage in a crisp suit I had ironed the night before, my eyes stinging with pride. I thought I had done everything right, that I had raised a man who understood the value of sacrifice. Life in Whitcomb moved like the tides, slow and familiar, and for many years my world was built on small routines and the belief that Daniel would always see me as the woman who had given him everything. I never remarried, never entertained the idea of sharing my home or my heart with anyone else. My joy was in seeing Daniel succeed, hearing his voice on the telephone when he called from the city, imagining him thriving in the life I had worked to make possible. Yet somewhere along the way, something shifted. The boy who once ran to the door when I returned from work became the man who called only when he needed something. At first it was money for a car repair, then help with his flat deposit, then my presence in his home to keep things tidy while he focused on his career. I told myself it was natural for a mother to help her grown son, that this was my place in life. I did not yet know that I was stepping quietly into a role I had not agreed to, one where love was measured by how much of myself I was willing to give and how little I expected in return. When Daniel first suggested I move into his home, it was on a quiet Sunday afternoon over tea, his voice warm with concern as he said, "Mum, you shouldn't be alone anymore." The words felt like a lifeline, and I accepted them as a gesture of love, imagining shared dinners, gentle conversations, and the comfort of family after so many years of evenings spent with only the hum of the refrigerator for company. The day I arrived, he carried my suitcase inside, and I looked around his modern, polished home with its gleaming kitchen and the faint scent of cedar from the floors, thinking perhaps this would be a new chapter for both of us. At first, it was just small things, me cooking dinner once or twice a week, folding a load of laundry while he was at work, wiping the counters after breakfast. I told myself I was simply helping, the way any mother would, grateful to be needed. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the nature of those tasks changed. A request to pick up a few things from the shop became a handwritten list covering half a page, meals became my responsibility every night, and laundry baskets seemed to multiply in corners of the house as if I were the only one who could see them. There was a shift in his tone too, something that stung more than I wanted to admit. "Can you sort that out?" he would say, no longer phrased as a question, but as an instruction. The first time I noticed it, I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining it, but the truth was beginning to press against me like a too tight garment. Evenings that I had once imagined as quiet time together turned into me ironing his shirts while he scrolled on his phone in the living room. He began leaving his coffee cups in the sink without a glance, his shoes scattered by the door, as though the house would tidy itself simply because I was in it. I began to feel less like a guest and more like staff, someone whose presence was defined by the work I could do. There were moments when I caught myself standing at the sink, my hands in soapy water, staring out at the garden and wondering how I had gone from the woman who ran her own home to someone who asked permission before using the washing machine. It was a subtle erosion, not a sudden collapse, the way a shoreline changes with the tide, each wave taking a little more sand until the shape is unrecognizable. I told myself it was temporary, that he was busy, that he would notice, but deep down I knew something fundamental had shifted, and that the invitation I had once seen as an act of love was beginning to feel like the opening chapter of a story I had not agreed to tell. It was a Saturday evening in early spring, when Daniel announced that some of his friends from work were coming over for drinks, and I remember feeling a little flutter of anticipation at the idea of meeting the people he spoke about so often. I spent the day tidying the living room until every cushion was perfectly plumped, polishing the glasses until they caught the light, and setting out a small spread of cheese and crackers, even though he had not asked me to. When the doorbell rang and the first guests arrived, I stood near the kitchen doorway, ready to greet them with the kind of warmth I thought any mother would show her son's friends. Daniel ushered them in with the easy charm he had always possessed, and when they reached me, he smiled in that quick, dismissive way I had seen before, but never quite understood, saying, "This is Margaret. She helps me keep the place in order." The words landed with a strange heaviness, as if someone had quietly shifted the ground beneath my feet. I smiled politely, because that is what one does in such moments, but inside I felt something sharp twist in my chest. Not Mum, not Mother, not even Mum who raised me alone, but Margaret, a woman defined by the upkeep of his home. His friends nodded politely, some offering half-hearted smiles, and the conversation quickly turned back to their work, their travels, their plans for the summer. I retreated to the kitchen under the pretense of checking the food, my hands suddenly restless, rearranging the cheese board even though there was nothing to fix. From the other room I could hear laughter, glasses clinking, the low hum of conversation, and I felt the strange sensation of being both in the house and outside of it at the same time, like a ghost lingering in familiar rooms that no longer belonged to her. Every so often, Daniel's voice would rise above the others, telling a story about a project at work or a weekend trip, and I would think about the years when I was the person he told his stories to first. Now, I was background, like the furniture, noticed only when I was useful. When they finally left that night, I collected the glasses, the plates, the crumbs left on the table, moving quietly so as not to disturb him while he scrolled through his phone. He did not thank me for hosting, nor for the work I had done to make his home welcoming. I washed the dishes slowly, letting the warm water run over my hands, and I told myself I would not let it bother me. But in truth, something unspoken had cracked open. That was the first time I felt reduced to a role instead of a relationship. The first time I realized that my place in his world was no longer defined by love, but by the invisible work I did to keep his life running smoothly. The days began to blur together until I could no longer tell one from the next, each morning, starting with the sound of Daniel's coffee machine, and ending with me folding the last of his laundry long after he had gone to bed. At first, I told myself it was only temporary, that I was simply helping my son while he focused on his career. But as the weeks turned into months, the truth became harder to ignore. My life had become an endless loop of laundry, cooking, and cleaning, not as a mother offering care to her child, but as an unpaid housekeeper whose value was measured only in tasks completed. I would wake early to iron his shirts until every crease was sharp, to make his breakfast exactly the way he liked it, and to scrub the kitchen until the counters gleamed. By midday, I would be working my way through piles of laundry, the hum of the washing machine a constant reminder of the work that was never truly done. In the evenings, I prepared his dinner and tidied the living room while he sat on the sofa, scrolling on his phone, barely looking up when I placed a plate in front of him. Friends I had known for decades stopped calling after too many times, hearing me say I could not meet them for lunch or visit because there were things Daniel needed me to finish first. At first, they sounded understanding, telling me we would find another time, but eventually the invitation stopped altogether, leaving me with long, quiet afternoons, where the only voice I heard was my own, speaking softly to the kettle or the cat that wandered occasionally through the garden. I began to feel the walls of the house closing in, each room a space I maintained, but no longer truly inhabited. The kitchen smelled perpetually of bleach and lemon, the air always just a little too clean, as if even the scent of life had been scrubbed away. I stopped buying flowers for the table because they would wilt before anyone noticed them. And I realized one day, while dusting the shelves in the living room, that there was nothing in the house that was truly mine. Every object belonged to Daniel. Every space reflected his taste, his routines, his comfort. My hands ached constantly from polishing, scrubbing, and lifting, yet the ache in my chest was worse. A slow, deep heaviness that came from feeling invisible. I thought often of the home I had left behind, the one Peter and I had built together, where every corner held a piece of our life. Here, I was only passing through, though I moved every day as if I were bound to the place by invisible chains. It no longer felt like living with my son. It felt like being trapped in a beautifully furnished cage where the door was never locked. Yet leaving somehow felt impossible. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the hours stretch out without distinction, when Daniel came home earlier than usual, his expression sharp and impatient. I was in the kitchen rinsing a mug when he walked past me without a greeting, heading straight for the bathroom. A moment later, I heard the sound of the door banging against the wall and his voice calling out in that clipped, irritated tone that always made me feel smaller than I am. He stepped into the kitchen, holding the toilet brush, his arm extended as if it were something distasteful he did not want to touch any longer than necessary, and without meeting my eyes, he said, "Go scrub the toilet, and do it properly this time." The words struck harder than I could have imagined, their sting not just in their content, but in the cold authority with which they were spoken. My body went cold from the inside out, as if a sudden draft had passed through me, and for a moment I could not move, caught between disbelief and a quiet, suffocating humiliation. My own son, the boy I had held through fevers, the boy whose school shoes I had polished before every term, now ordering me like I was hired help who had failed to meet expectations. I took the brush from him without a word, afraid that if I spoke, my voice would betray the tremor in my chest. In the bathroom, the smell of bleach from earlier that morning still lingered, a bitter reminder that I had already cleaned this space. I knelt on the cool tile floor, the bristles of the brush scraping against porcelain as I worked in silence, the steady swish and grind of the motion almost drowning out the sound of my own thoughts. My tears began to fall without warning, splashing into the water with small, soundless ripples, mixing with the cleaning solution until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. I kept my head down, scrubbing as if the act itself could erase the words he had just spoken, as if I could scour away the shame clinging to my skin. In that moment, I felt the years of sacrifice pressing down on me, the long hours of work, the missed meals, the quiet endurance of loneliness, all for a son who now saw me as nothing more than someone to do the tasks he did not wish to do himself. The bathroom tiles blurred through my tears, their perfect white, suddenly oppressive, like the walls of a place I could not escape. When I finished, I replaced the brush in its holder, washed my hands slowly under the cold tap, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at me was one I recognized yet no longer truly knew. A woman worn down, not by time alone, but by the steady erosion of her worth. Daniel did not know that tucked deep inside the zipped pocket of my worn leather purse, beneath the folded receipts and the neatly stacked loyalty cards, was a slip of paper that could change everything. It was not the kind of secret one stumbles upon lightly, nor the sort one forgets about by accident. 6 months earlier, on a drizzly Thursday, I had stopped at the corner shop after picking up milk and bread, my hair damp from the misty rain. On a whim, I had bought a single lottery ticket, sliding the coins across the counter to the shopkeeper who smiled absently, his attention already shifting to the next customer. I tucked the ticket into my purse without much thought, expecting it to be like all the others I had bought over the years, a small indulgence with no real return. Days later, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, I checked the numbers against the ones printed in the newspaper, my breath catching as each one lined up until the realization settled over me like an unexpected weight. Nearly £1.8 million. Not the kind of money that buys palaces, but enough to ensure comfort for the rest of my life. Enough to buy back my independence and wrap it around me like a warm coat in winter. Yet I had not claimed it, not right away. I kept it hidden, the knowledge folded away as carefully as the ticket itself, unsure what to do, unsure if I even trusted myself with the enormity of the change it could bring. Perhaps, in some quiet part of me, I feared that claiming it would force me to make decisions I was not ready to make, that it would shine too much light on a life I had learned to keep small. For months, I carried it with me everywhere, the purse always close at hand, the secret pressing lightly against my side like a heartbeat only I could feel. I imagined a dozen different futures for it, from a little flat by the sea to a second-hand bookshop where I could spend my days among stories instead of chores. And then came that afternoon with the toilet brush in Daniel's outstretched hand, his voice sharp and dismissive. The cold weight of his words settling over me like a final verdict on my place in his home, as I knelt on the bathroom floor, scrubbing under his instruction. The thought of that ticket flared in my mind with sudden clarity, not as a dream, but as an answer. It was no longer a question of whether I would use it, but when and how. The decision that had lingered for months was made in that moment, quiet but absolute, the way a door can close without sound, yet change the shape of the room forever. I would not tell him. I would not tell anyone. This time, the next chapter of my life would be written by my own hand. There are moments in life when a memory returns so vividly that it feels less like remembering and more like being pulled back through time. And as I sat alone in my room that evening, the shadows long across the carpet, I could almost hear Peter's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside me. It was many years ago, not long after Daniel was born, and we had been sitting on the old garden bench behind our house, the one Peter built himself from reclaimed wood. The late summer light had been soft and golden, and I remember leaning against him, tired but content, watching Daniel sleep in his pram. Peter had turned to me then, his eyes serious in a way that made me straighten, and he said, "Never let anyone forget who you are, Maggie, even your own child." At the time, I had laughed softly, brushing it off as one of his little bursts of wisdom, the kind he would sometimes offer when we were alone. but it settled somewhere deep inside me all the same. He went on to tell me that love should never mean erasing yourself, that even as a mother I was still a whole person, with my own worth and my own voice, and that if I ever forgot that, the world would forget it too. Sitting in that dim room now, decades later, I realized I had not just let Daniel forget who I was, I had allowed myself to forget. Somewhere in the long years of raising him alone after Peter's death, of sacrificing my own comfort so he could have more, of working until my body ached so that his life could be easier, I had let the boundaries blur until my identity was wrapped entirely around being his mother. That had been a choice I made out of love, but love, I could see now, had been twisted into something else, something that took without giving back. Daniel had not only taken my time, he had taken my dignity, and worse, I had handed it over piece by piece, convincing myself it was only temporary. The memory of Peter's voice that night cut through the haze like a sharp wind off the sea, bracing and undeniable, and I could almost see him there, looking at me the way he used to when he wanted me to hear him with my whole heart. I thought of the lottery ticket hidden in my purse, the way it seemed to hum now with possibility, and I understood that it was more than money. It was a key to step out of this life I had been trapped in, to reclaim the self I had been before my worth was measured in chores completed and orders obeyed. Peter had trusted me to remember who I was, and I had let that promise falter, but I would not let it die entirely. That night, for the first time in years, I felt the faint but steady ember of defiance begin to glow. That night, the house was steeped in silence, the kind that feels heavy rather than peaceful, and I moved through it like a shadow that no one could see. I did not slam drawers or leave doors ajar as I might have in another life, when leaving would have been an act of anger instead of quiet resolve. Every sound seemed louder than it was: the rustle of fabric, the click of a zipper, the faint creak of the floor beneath my feet, and I paused often, listening for any sign that Daniel might stir in his room. My suitcase sat open on the bed, a small one that had been tucked away at the back of the wardrobe for years, its corners worn but sturdy enough for what I needed. I chose only the essentials, folding them neatly, not because I cared how they looked when I unpacked them, but because I needed the order to steady my hands. My coat lay across the chair, and in its inner pocket was the lottery ticket, the slip of paper that felt as though it carried the weight of an entire future. I touched it once, briefly, the way one might touch a talisman, then let it rest where it was. From the drawer of the bedside table, I took the photograph of Peter holding Daniel when he was just a baby, Peter's broad hands cradling that small, soft body, with a tenderness that still had the power to bring a lump to my throat. That photograph had been the anchor through years when loneliness pressed hard against me, and it felt only right to carry it now into whatever came next. I left everything else behind: the clothes that filled the wardrobe, the furniture I had polished, the little ornaments I had dusted week after week. None of it mattered anymore. The house did not feel like mine, and nothing in it carried the warmth of belonging. As I closed the suitcase, I glanced around the room one final time, not with nostalgia, but with a strange clarity, seeing it as it truly was, a place I had inhabited but never been allowed to own in spirit. I moved to the front door slowly, pausing to slip on my shoes, the sound of the laces pulling taut loud in the stillness. Outside, the air was cool, the faint smell of the sea carried on the night breeze, and I felt it fill my lungs with something close to relief. I did not look back at the house, because there was nothing there for me to look back to. The life I was leaving had already ended in the moment Daniel handed me that toilet brush, and what I carried with me now was not just a suitcase, but the first breath of freedom I had taken in years. The street was almost empty when I stepped out into the night, the quiet broken only by the distant hum of the sea and the occasional hiss of wind weaving between the houses. I had booked the taxi on my phone with trembling hands, half expecting Daniel to appear in the hallway before I could leave. But the minutes passed without interruption, until a pair of dim headlights turned the corner and slowed to a stop in front of me. The driver was an older gentleman with a kind face, his hair silver under the glow of the street lamp. And when he stepped out to help with my suitcase, he did so without the impatient haste I had grown used to from strangers. Once we were both inside, the car pulled away softly, the tires rolling over the damp road with a sound that reminded me faintly of the gentle swish of waves on the shore. I gave him the name of the modest seaside hotel I had chosen, a place I had only ever passed in the busier days of summer, its windows glowing faintly in the distance. He did not ask questions beyond what was necessary, yet I could feel his eyes glance at me in the rear-view mirror from time to time, measuring the tension in my shoulders, the way I kept one hand inside my coat pocket, fingers curled protectively around the lottery ticket. Halfway through the journey, as the town fell away and the darkness of the open road closed in around us, he spoke in a voice that was both gentle and certain, saying, "Sometimes you've got to choose yourself, love." The words seemed to slip past my ears and settle deeper, finding a place inside me that had been waiting to hear them for far too long. I did not answer right away, letting the truth of them expand slowly in my chest, like a lungful of air after being held underwater. The car smelled faintly of tobacco and peppermint, and outside the window, the lights of the town became fewer until only the moonlit sea stretched beside us, endless and calm. For the first time in months, I felt the tight knot between my ribs begin to loosen, as though the road itself was carrying me away from the weight I had been living under. When we reached the hotel, the driver stepped out once more to place my suitcase gently on the curb, and I thanked him, my voice steadier than I expected. He gave me a small nod, as if to say he understood without needing to be told anything more, and drove away, leaving me standing in the cool night air with the sound of the tide in the distance. As I walked toward the hotel door, the faint light spilling from its windows felt like a welcome, and I knew that whatever waited for me inside would be mine to shape, not something handed to me with conditions. The morning light spilled through the thin curtains of the hotel room, pale and clean, as though the world itself had been washed overnight. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, my coat folded neatly beside me, the pocket holding the ticket that had lived so close to me for 6 months. My hands felt unsteady as I reached for it, the paper warm from being kept so near, edges slightly softened from the countless times my fingers had traced it in moments of doubt or quiet hope. The walk to the lottery office was short, the street still waking, shop shutters rattling open, and the smell of fresh bread drifting from a nearby bakery. I pushed open the glass door and stepped inside, greeted by the faint hum of a heater and the quiet clatter of a keyboard behind the counter. The clerk, a woman in her 40s with bright eyes and hair pulled back into a neat bun, looked up and smiled politely, asking how she could help. I laid the ticket on the counter, my hand lingering on it for a moment before I let go, and told her softly that I believed it was a winning one. She took it without hesitation, scanning it through the machine, and the sound of the confirmation tone seemed far too small for what it meant. Her smile widened, and she said the words that felt almost unreal. "Congratulations, you've won." I nodded, unable to find the right response, my pulse quickening as she explained the process, each step a bridge carrying me further from the life I had left behind. When she handed me the forms to sign, my pen moved steadily, the letters of my name anchoring me to the moment, proof that this was happening, that the choice now belonged to me. Minutes later, with a few clicks and a confirmation on her screen, my bank account was no longer a small pool I had to guard carefully, but a deep well of possibility. "Nearly £1.8 million," she said, her voice warm with genuine delight for me. The number did not feel like money. It felt like air, like space, like a key turning in a lock I had almost forgotten was there. As I stepped back out into the street, the sunlight felt different on my face. Not brighter, but freer, as though it no longer had to pass through the cloud of resignation I had lived under for so long. I knew I could buy whatever I needed now, but the real wealth was in the rush of choices flooding my mind. Choices that were mine alone, unmeasured by anyone else's needs or demands. For the first time in years, I felt as though I was standing at the threshold of a life I could shape entirely on my own terms, and I intended to step through it without hesitation. The flat was small, but when I first stepped inside and saw the wide window that opened onto the endless stretch of water, I knew it was mine, in a way no place had been for years. The walls were bare at first, the rooms quiet except for the low hum of the radiator, but I saw them as a canvas waiting for my touch. I bought plants and placed them where the sunlight pooled in the afternoons, their leaves catching the light in a way that made the whole room feel alive. I filled the shelves with books, some old favourites from second-hand shops, and some new, their spines uncreased, promising stories I had yet to enter. The days became my own, unshaped by anyone else's demands, and I began to explore them as carefully as a child exploring a new garden. I reached out to friends I had not spoken to in years, voices on the phone breaking into warm laughter, as though no time had passed at all. We met for coffee in little cafes by the harbour, and I found myself listening more, speaking more, feeling the weight of my own thoughts again, without the constant undercurrent of someone else's needs. One afternoon, I passed the community centre that had been my quiet anchor after Peter died, the place where I had gone to sit among others when the silence at home felt too large. I remembered how they had given me tea without asking for anything in return, how they had helped me find small jobs when the bills had threatened to overtake me, and I knew immediately what I wanted to do. I arranged an anonymous donation large enough to repair the roof and fund their programs for years to come, picturing the comfort it might bring to someone else who found themselves adrift. I signed up for a local art class, something I had always thought I would try one day but never had the time or courage for. And the first time I put brush to canvas, I felt the strange joy of creating something that had no purpose beyond my own pleasure. The flat slowly transformed into a place that carried my imprint in every corner, from the scent of fresh flowers on the kitchen table to the worn throw draped across the arm of the sofa. In the evenings, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the way the water caught the fading light, the horizon melting into gold and rose. There was no one to tell me how to spend my hours, no one to measure my worth in chores completed or duties fulfilled. I was not just building a home, I was rebuilding myself, piece by piece, with the quiet conviction that this life was mine now, and I would fill it only with what I chose to keep. It was nearly 3 weeks after I had left when my phone rang and Daniel's name lit up the screen, the sound breaking the quiet of my new flat like a stone dropped into still water. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear his voice, to know what he would say after my absence had settled in. I answered, and there was no greeting, only the sharpness of his words spilling out before I could even speak. "Why did you leave without telling me? You left me with a mess." His tone was not hurt or confused. It was irritated, as though my departure had been nothing more than an inconvenience, an interruption to the smooth running of his household. I sat in my armchair by the window, looking out at the silver sheen of the water, and let his words wash over me without rushing to fill the silence. I thought of all the mornings I had risen before him, all the meals cooked, the shirts ironed, the floors scrubbed, and how not once had he stopped to thank me. I thought of the toilet brush in my hand, the humiliation sitting heavy in my chest, and the way I had packed my suitcase in the quiet of the night without a single tear, because the decision had already been made in my bones. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost gentle, but each word was weighted with the truth I had carried for far too long. Daniel, I am not your housekeeper. I am your mother. When you remember that, we can talk. There was a pause on the line, the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty, and for a moment, I wondered if he would respond with something that might open a door between us. Instead, he scoffed lightly, muttered something about me being dramatic, and ended the call. I sat there for a long time afterward, the phone resting in my lap, the sound of the tide against the harbour wall filling the space where his voice had been. There was no ache, no sudden rush of doubt about my choice, only a quiet certainty that I had spoken the truth, and that whether or not he chose to hear it was no longer my responsibility. Outside, a gull swooped low over the water, its wings catching the light, and I thought how some creatures know when to leave a place that no longer feeds them. I had left, and I had not withered. I had taken root somewhere new, and the soil was rich with possibility. Daniel could call again, or not at all, but I would not return to the life I had shed. Some doors, once closed, are not meant to be opened again. It was a rainy afternoon when the second call came, the kind of rain that makes the sea look like steel and blurs the line between the water and the sky. I had been reading by the window, the soft drumming on the glass, a comfort. When the phone buzzed in my lap and Daniel's name appeared again, this time his voice was different, wrapped in an unfamiliar politeness that felt stiff and deliberate, like a suit worn for the first time. He asked how I had been, whether I was settling in well, and then, as if sliding it in casually, mentioned that he had heard from someone in town that I had bought myself a flat with a view of the water. His tone carried a curiosity that was too measured to be innocent, and before I could respond, he added that word had also reached him about a large anonymous donation to the community centre, a gesture that had apparently made quite a stir among the locals. I could almost see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to fit the pieces together, trying to understand how I had gone from the woman who scrubbed his floors to someone who could move out without a backward glance and leave behind a generous gift for others. He spoke of family loyalty, letting the words hang in the air as though they were an invitation, or perhaps a lure, and I felt the weight of what he was truly asking without saying it outright. I did not mention the lottery. I did not tell him about the morning I had walked into that office, or the way my account had transformed in the time it takes for a kettle to boil. I simply let him wonder, answering his questions with gentle half-truths, saying that I had been fortunate, that I had made some decisions for my future, that it felt good to be able to help others the way I had once been helped. He hesitated, perhaps hoping I would offer more, but I kept my tone light, my words few, allowing the silence to grow comfortable for me and uncomfortable for him. When the call ended, I set the phone down and returned to my book, though I found myself staring out at the rain instead, thinking how quickly people notice when you stop living quietly in their shadow. I knew Daniel's mind would not rest, that he would turn over every scrap of gossip until he thought he saw the shape of the truth. But some truths are not for everyone, and this one belonged to me, alone. Let him wonder, I thought, because mystery, like distance, can be a kind of protection. The rain kept falling, steady and sure, and I felt the same steady surety in myself, knowing I had no obligation to explain the life I had finally claimed as my own. I booked the ticket to Italy on a quiet evening, the kind of evening when the sea outside my window was calm enough to look like glass, and I could almost hear Peter's voice telling me how much he had always wanted to go. He used to talk about it on slow Sunday mornings, reading aloud from travel articles he found in the paper, describing sunlit hills and narrow cobblestone streets, his eyes warm with a longing that neither of us could afford to satisfy back then. Stepping off the plane in Naples, the air felt different, softer somehow, scented faintly with lemon and salt. And I knew even before the taxi pulled away from the airport that I was breathing in a new chapter of my life. I stayed in a small family-run inn, the kind where breakfast is served at tables dressed in white linen, and the owners greet you as though you have been expected for years. Each morning, I wandered through markets where the stalls overflowed with ripe tomatoes and glossy olives, the colours so vivid they looked as if they had been painted into the day. I ate pasta in quiet squares, where the only sound was the low murmur of locals talking over their own meals, and I lingered there for hours, letting the sunlight warm my skin until I could feel it sink into me like something I had been missing. In the afternoons, I walked along the cliffs of the Amalfi coast, the sea spread out beneath me in shades of blue I had no words for, the sky and water meeting in a seamless embrace. I thought of Peter often, not with sadness, but with a kind of gratitude, as though I were carrying him with me in each view, each taste, each step. One evening, I sat on a terrace with a glass of wine, watching the sun sink into the horizon, the sky bleeding gold and rose into the waves, and I realized it had been decades since I had felt this way, weightless and untethered, belonging entirely to myself. There was no clock to watch, no list of tasks waiting, no voice calling from another room, just the gentle hum of life around me, and the certainty that I was part of it in a way I had not been for so long. The days blurred together in the best possible way, each one unfolding like a gift I did not have to earn, and I found myself smiling without even realizing it. On my last morning, I stood on the balcony of my room, the cool breeze carrying the scent of the sea and the sound of church bells in the distance, and I promised myself that this would not be the last time. Freedom, I understood then, was not just the absence of chains. It was the presence of joy, and I had finally stepped into both. I sat at the small oak desk by the window of my flat, the one that overlooked the harbour where the water shifted constantly between silver and blue, and I began to write my will with a steady hand. The decision had been growing in me for months, quietly taking shape in the same way a seed pushes through the soil when the season is right. I thought about what the money had given me, not just freedom, but the ability to choose, and I wanted that choice to ripple outward beyond my own life. I remembered the years after Peter died, when the weight of raising Daniel alone felt like standing in a storm with no shelter, and how small acts of kindness from others had kept me from being washed away. I thought of the community centre that had once been my refuge, the women I had met there who were piecing their lives back together with little more than determination, and the elderly neighbours who had stayed in their homes only because someone had fought for their independence. These were the people I wanted my fortune to touch. Most of it, I decided, would go to charities that supported elderly independents and single mothers, the quiet fighters who often went unseen. In my will, I left Daniel something as well, enough for him to live comfortably if he chose wisely, but not so much that he could squander it without thought, or use it as a lever to pull me back into a role I no longer filled. It was not about punishment, but about balance, about giving him a gift that would carry weight without breeding complacency. As I signed the final page, I felt no bitterness, only a calm clarity, as though the act itself had stitched closed the last loose thread of a life I had left behind. I looked out at the water, the tide moving in its patient rhythm, and thought about the long journey that had brought me here. From the woman scrubbing a toilet in silence, to the woman deciding where her life's work and good fortune would go. People often think leaving is about running away, but the truth is that I had not been fleeing Daniel, not entirely. I had been walking toward myself, toward the version of me that Peter had seen and loved, the one he had reminded me never to let anyone forget. In the quiet of that afternoon, with the sun glancing off the harbour and the smell of salt drifting through the open window, I whispered those words aloud, as much to remind myself as to seal them in the air. I was never running away from him. I was walking toward myself, and in that walk, I had found not only freedom, but a legacy worth leaving behind.